Leavenworth doesn't need to kill you. It just waits for you to kill yourself. Former inmate statement, cited in Kansas City Star, 1989. The sound is the first thing they remember. The metallic slam of the gate, the deep echo rolling through the limestone corridors like thunder in a grave. It isn't just a door closing, it's a verdict. And in Leavenworth, that sound means one thing: you belong to the walls now. Leavenworth sits on a quiet Kansas plain, surrounded by farmland and silence. But to the men who live behind its razor wire, it's a living organism, breathing, listening, punishing. The air smells like old concrete, disinfectant, and regret. Every corridor hums with secrets that stretch back more than 100 years. Built in 1903 and opened in 1906, the United States Penitentiary Leavenworth was supposed to represent progress, a model prison for the 20th century. Congress called it a new chapter in humane incarceration. But the men who were sent there would later call it something else, the Castle of Fear. Early records describe an environment designed to break the spirit before the body. Prisoners worked 10-hour days in sweat-drenched workshops, weaving textiles, forging metal, and crushing rock. They marched in silence, eyes down, never speaking unless spoken to. Warden J.K. McLeod once said in 1912, "A man who learns silence learns discipline." But inside Leavenworth, silence wasn't discipline. It was survival. The Al Capone years. By the late 1920s, the prison became the federal government's ultimate show of force. When Al Capone arrived in 1931, the world's most feared gangster faced something he couldn't bribe or threaten: the complete absence of control. According to court documents and Bureau of Prisons archives, Capone's entry drew massive press attention. But inside, fame meant nothing. He was stripped, searched, and sent to a small concrete cell like everyone else. Inmates later recalled that Capone tried to run the place like Chicago, until he realized Leavenworth doesn't negotiate. The prison's rigid hierarchy stripped even mob royalty of identity. Guards addressed him only as Inmate 40886. A 1932 federal report detailed multiple attempts by Capone to manipulate guards through coded messages, hidden money, and favors, all of which failed. Within months, the once laughing gangster was described as withdrawn and anxious. He wasn't the first to break. He wouldn't be the last. The architecture of control. Leavenworth was built like a fortress, modeled after medieval castles and designed to intimidate as much as to imprison. Massive limestone blocks, 40-foot-high walls, and echoing halls create an acoustic effect that amplifies even the smallest sounds: a cough, a footstep, a distant scream. Psychologists who later studied the layout described it as environmental punishment. The building itself conditions fear. Every hallway looks the same. Every cell feels identical. Inmates lose all sense of direction and time. One former correctional officer described it in an interview with Time magazine. You could walk a straight line for 20 minutes and not know if you were going forward or backward. Leavenworth was engineered for disorientation. And that confusion wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. The ghosts of the yard. Through the decades, countless men walked through those gates: prohibition bootleggers, bank robbers, and killers from every corner of the country. Some found faith. Others found madness. The prison cemetery, known as Leavenworth Hill, holds hundreds of unmarked graves. Many are inmates who died violently, some by their own hands, others under unexplained circumstances recorded in federal logs. Between 1920 and 1960, at least 47 suicides were confirmed, and dozens more listed as accidents. In 1956, a Bureau of Prisons inspector wrote in his private notes, "There is an atmosphere of decay here, not physical but moral. The men do not age. They erode." Even guards weren't immune. Over the years, several correctional officers left abruptly due to what they described as psychological fatigue, nightmares, paranoia, and a fear of the silence itself. The unseen hierarchy. Despite the iron discipline, Leavenworth developed its own shadow government. Prison gangs existed before the term was even coined. Long before the Mexican Mafia or Aryan Brotherhood rose in other prisons, Leavenworth's early inmates formed alliances based on trade, protection, and control. Each tier had its boss, and each boss had enforcers. Food rations, work assignments, and contraband all moved through these underground networks. According to early FBI intelligence memos, several of these inmate councils maintained influence over guards through threats, bribes, and blackmail. It was the same dynamic that would later define federal prisons across America, a constant tug-of-war between authority and adaptation. The price of defiance. In 1948, that tug-of-war snapped. Following years of overcrowding and resentment, Leavenworth erupted into a full-scale riot, one of the largest in U.S. history. Over 2,000 inmates seized the kitchen, destroyed the workshops, and held several guards hostage. For 72 hours, the federal government lost control of its most powerful prison. The standoff ended only when soldiers surrounded the facility with tanks and tear gas. When it was over, 3 men were dead, dozens wounded, and the myth of control was shattered. Leavenworth's warden later described it as a reminder that fear is a double-edged sword, it keeps order until it explodes. The shadow of isolation. After the riot, reforms came, briefly. Cells were modernized, and new oversight procedures introduced. But the spirit of the place never changed. Even decades later, when psychologists interviewed former inmates, the responses were eerily similar. You don't remember faces. You remember echoes. The walls breathe at night. You forget what sunlight feels like. The Bureau of Prisons began transferring its most dangerous inmates to newer facilities, Marion, then ADX Florence, but Leavenworth remained a place that molded men through quiet terror. To this day, many ex-inmates refuse to speak about their time there. Some can't. Some won't. Because inside Leavenworth, punishment isn't loud, it's silent. And that silence becomes the loudest thing you ever hear. Psychological warfare, how Leavenworth breaks the mind before the men. They don't need chains to hold you in Leavenworth. The walls do the work. Ex-inmate testimony, U.S. District Records, 1979. Leavenworth was never designed merely to hold criminals. It was designed to reshape them. Not with therapy or reform, but through slow, methodical control of the human mind. Every sound, every rule, every ounce of monotony worked toward one purpose, breaking a man without touching him. By the late 20th century, psychologists and criminologists had begun studying what they called Leavenworth syndrome, a term unofficially used among federal inmates to describe the mental unraveling that occurred after years inside the prison's limestone walls. It wasn't insanity in the clinical sense. It was erosion, the slow decay of self. The science of control. A 1984 report by the Bureau of Prisons described Leavenworth's daily routine as consistent, repetitive, and absolute. Lights on at 6 a.m. Counts every hour. Meals served on precise schedules. Movement only in silence, eyes forward, no conversation unless authorized. The schedule was so rigid that even seconds felt like hours. Prisoners would mark time by the echo of guards' boots or the sound of distant steel doors clanging shut. For men who once thrived on chaos, mobsters, gang leaders, cartel lords, the monotony was worse than violence. Violence you could fight. Silence you couldn't. A psychologist who visited the facility in 1986 told the Washington Post. Leavenworth creates a complete sensory uniformity. There is no color, no individuality, no unpredictability, and the human brain is not built to survive that indefinitely. Isolation units, the prison within the prison. Deep beneath the main cell block sat a series of isolation units, known among inmates as the pit. Officially, these were segregation cells, used for disciplinary confinement or protection. Unofficially, they were something else, the ultimate form of psychological warfare. The cells were windowless, soundproof, and always cold. Prisoners inside could go days without hearing another human voice. Food was passed through a slot, lights never turned off completely. According to declassified Bureau of Prisons documents, the average stay in segregation lasted 60 to 90 days. Some men, however, were kept far longer. A 1992 inspection report noted one inmate who had been isolated for over 15 consecutive months, his only contact being the tray slot and a brief weekly shower. He was later transferred to a mental health unit after displaying severe withdrawal, paranoia, and delusional behavior. An ex-officer described the atmosphere in a 2011 documentary. You could feel the madness in those corridors. It was like the walls remembered every scream. The experiments and the aftermath. During the Cold War era, Leavenworth was quietly involved in several federal psychological studies on inmate behavior and rehabilitation. While none were illegal by the standards of the time, they pushed ethical boundaries. According to archived Department of Justice memos, researchers studied how prolonged isolation, limited light exposure, and deprivation of stimuli affected inmate cooperation and behavior modification. The official claim was rehabilitation through environmental control. But for many prisoners, it became something else, torment disguised as science. Former inmates recalled that after weeks in the pit, colors seemed brighter, sounds sharper, and sleep nearly impossible. Some developed what modern psychologists would now call institutional hallucinations, visions and voices produced by sensory starvation. By the late 1970s, growing pressure from civil rights attorneys led to court challenges. The federal government quietly ended most of these experiments, but their legacy remained etched in Leavenworth's reputation. The prison was no longer just a facility, it was a living laboratory of human endurance. The breaking point. In 1991, a riot in the East Wing began with something small, a broken radio. An inmate refused to return to his cell after a guard confiscated the device, claiming it was his only link to the outside world. That minor defiance sparked a two-day standoff involving dozens of inmates. When interviewed later by investigators, one participant explained why it escalated so fast. "We weren't angry about the radio. We were angry about being forgotten." That word, forgotten, summed up the psychological decay of Leavenworth. Most inmates weren't fighting for freedom anymore. They were fighting not to vanish inside the monotony. According to court filings from that year, suicide attempts had doubled compared to the previous decade. The Bureau of Prisons attributed it to environmental stressors, a phrase that barely captured the truth. Behind every suicide was a simple realization. When a man's body is trapped, he still dreams of escape. When his mind is trapped, he stops dreaming entirely. The guards' war. The fear wasn't one-sided. Guards lived under constant psychological strain too. Interviews with correctional officers published by the Kansas City Star in 2000 revealed that many suffered from insomnia, depression, and hypervigilance long after leaving the job. One guard recalled hearing phantom cell doors slam long after retirement. Another admitted, "You start to mirror the inmates. You scan faces, you speak less, you trust no one. The place rewires you." Leavenworth didn't just confine men, it transformed everyone inside it. Inmates. Officers. Wardens. Even visiting psychologists. No one left untouched. The transfer generation. As the prison system evolved, many of the most violent offenders were transferred to the new ADX Florence Supermax in Colorado. The public believed Leavenworth was softening. But insiders knew better. Even without the worst offenders, the psychology of control persisted. By the early 2000s, the prison became a breeding ground for mental instability. Reports from the Federal Correctional Oversight Board indicated that nearly 40% of inmates displayed symptoms of depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress linked to prolonged confinement. Yet the institution continued to function like a machine, routine over reason, silence over speech. As one prison chaplain told PBS Frontline, "It's not the violence that breaks men here. It's the quiet. You begin to hear your own guilt too loud to ignore. The sound of nothing." Leavenworth's greatest weapon has always been its silence. No sirens, no chaos, just an endless hum of fluorescent light and footsteps that echo like ghosts. In that soundless world, time loses meaning. A week feels like a year. A man forgets what his own voice sounds like. And in the stillness, the walls seem to whisper back the same message every prisoner has heard for over a century. You are not in control. You never were. Leavenworth doesn't destroy through violence. It destroys through endurance. The body may survive it, but the mind rarely walks out whole. The codes of power, hidden alliances that rule Leavenworth from within. In here, there's no democracy, only order. You follow the code or you disappear. Anonymous inmate, Federal Testimony Excerpt, 2008. Leavenworth's walls have always held two prisons. The one run by the Bureau of Prisons, with guards, schedules, and federal policy. And the other, invisible, silent, and far more efficient, ruled by the inmates themselves. This hidden government has no name, no constitution, and no elections. But for more than a century, it has maintained control through one unbreakable rule: the code. The birth of the code. The code wasn't written in books or carved into cell walls. It began as whispers, survival wisdom passed from one generation of inmates to the next. By the 1940s, long before modern prison gangs were officially recognized, Leavenworth already had a functioning hierarchy of power. According to early FBI intelligence reports, inmates organized themselves by ethnicity, trade, and crime type. The Italians controlled gambling. The Irish ran the kitchens. The bank robbers handled outside smuggling connections. And everyone paid respect to the yard bosses, the men who settled disputes when guards couldn't. No one called it a gang back then. It was simply the order. One former inmate described it years later in a 1971 parole hearing. You could live 10 years in Leavenworth without a fight, if you understood how to play by the rules. But if you didn't, you wouldn't last 10 days. Over time, that invisible order evolved into a self-sustaining ecosystem. It governed every trade, every favor, every threat. And while the faces changed, the system never died, it adapted. The silent hierarchy. By the 1980s, Leavenworth had become the unofficial capital of the federal underworld. With the influx of cartel figures, gang leaders, and international traffickers, the inmate code merged into something more complex, a syndicate of alliances that crossed racial and national lines. Each group maintained its own structure but submitted to one principle: peace through balance. No one wanted open war inside Leavenworth. The prison's architecture, small yards, shared corridors, blind corners, made chaos suicidal. So they created the council. The council wasn't official, but it was real enough. According to a declassified 1995 Bureau of Prisons memo, the council referred to a group of influential inmates, older, respected figures who met informally to prevent riots, approve punishments, and mediate conflicts. One investigator described it this way: they ruled with consensus, not dictatorship. Violence was strategic, not emotional. Every action served stability. Even guards knew of it, and often cooperated indirectly. A stable prison meant fewer incidents, fewer reports, fewer bodies. Everyone benefited, in silence. Trade and control. Leavenworth had always been an economy. From its earliest days, men traded favors for cigarettes, food, or protection. But as time passed, the stakes grew. By the late 1990s, contraband became the new currency, not just drugs, but phones, SIM cards, and connections to the outside. The same smuggling systems that once moved moonshine and heroin now moved information. According to an internal Department of Justice report from 2004, Leavenworth's internal black market was estimated to generate hundreds of thousands of dollars annually in outside proceeds. That money didn't just circulate randomly. It flowed through structured channels, coded messages, third-party payments, and legal mail disguised with hidden signals. The brotherhoods inside used religious services, educational programs, and even law libraries as meeting grounds. To outsiders, it looked peaceful. To insiders, it was organized control. An ex-officer interviewed for The Atlantic in 2016 described it perfectly. You could walk through the chapel and see three rival factions praying together. But every bowed head was calculating something. Loyalty over blood. Unlike typical prison gangs, Leavenworth's network wasn't built solely on race or territory, it was built on intelligence and trust. Members could come from different backgrounds as long as they followed the code: respect, silence, discipline. Breaking the code was the one unforgivable sin. Snitches, informants, or anyone caught speaking with federal investigators were erased, socially first, then physically if necessary. One 2008 homicide inside the facility, according to U.S. District Court filings, was linked to a man who had allegedly provided information on contraband trades. The body was found in the laundry area. The official report listed the death as under investigation. No one was ever charged. Inside, everyone already knew what it meant. Justice had been carried out, not by the government, but by the system within the system. The guards' compromise. Guards quickly learned that fighting the code was pointless. Many chose coexistence instead. Leavenworth wasn't a war zone, it was a negotiation. In return for stability, the officers allowed certain routines to persist. Inmates got limited autonomy in the yard. minor trades were overlooked. Quiet order was rewarded with privileges. A retired correctional lieutenant told Reuters in 2014. You could sense it, the men policed themselves. We didn't have to run the prison, they did. We just kept the peace. The arrangement was unofficial, but it worked. Leavenworth's violence rates dropped dramatically compared to other maximum security prisons. But beneath that calm surface lay the cost of peace, silence, fear, and control. The hidden language. Over time, the code developed its own vocabulary. Words meant different things depending on who said them. Church could mean a meeting. Blessing could mean a shipment. Paperwork meant loyalty verification, a background check on whether you'd ever informed. Even tattoos became communication. A small number on a finger, a symbol hidden under a collar, these marked allegiance without a word spoken. Federal intelligence analysts, reviewing surveillance footage in 2012, concluded that Leavenworth inmates operate under an evolved linguistic and symbolic system akin to encrypted communication. To an outsider, it was just conversation. To those inside, it was strategy. Collapse of the old order. By the mid-2010s, a new generation of inmates began arriving, younger, more impulsive, raised on street fame and social media clout. They didn't understand the old code. They filmed fights on contraband phones, posted them online, and disrupted the silent balance that had kept Leavenworth stable for decades. The council struggled to adapt. The old enforcers were aging, the new inmates didn't respect hierarchy, and technology had shattered secrecy. In 2017, a leaked video from inside Leavenworth went viral, showing a violent altercation in a corridor that should have been under full supervision. The clip exposed not just inmate violence but the existence of contraband networks the Bureau had long denied. Federal investigators launched a full probe. Dozens of transfers followed. Some of the prison's longest-serving inmates, men who had maintained order for decades, were quietly moved to higher security facilities. It was the end of the silent era. But as one federal official admitted off-record to the Associated Press, you can move the men, but you can't move the code. It always finds its way back. The modern brotherhood. Today, Leavenworth's brotherhood has evolved once more discreet, more digital, but still alive. Inmates use encrypted messaging apps hidden on smuggled devices. Deals happen in code words disguised in letters to families. The system that began in whispers now travels through Wi-Fi. New alliances are built not on fear, but on mutual survival, quiet agreements between old-timers and new recruits, between rival factions and shared enemies. And though modern technology has changed the landscape, the ancient rule still governs everything inside. The walls belong to the government. The silence belongs to us. Leavenworth's true power has never been in its guards or its guns, but in the minds of the men who refuse to be erased. The legacy of fear, how Leavenworth's darkness shaped the modern prison system. Every prison built after Leavenworth tried to fix its mistakes, but ended up copying its soul. Former Bureau of Prisons architect, Federal Archives Oral History Project, 2009. For over a century, Leavenworth Penitentiary has been more than just a prison. It has been the template, the origin point of America's obsession with control, surveillance, and the psychology of punishment. Every federal facility built since its creation carries its DNA, the rigid order, the endless silence, and the idea that fear itself could reform men. Yet, Leavenworth's true legacy is not its architecture, it's the people it changed. Guards. Inmates. Lawmakers. Society. Every one of them left a piece of themselves in the shadow of those limestone walls. The blueprint of control. When the first blueprints for Leavenworth were drawn in 1897, reformers believed structure could save men from chaos. They imagined a place that would rehabilitate through discipline and labor, a cathedral of correction. Instead, they built a fortress that became a psychological experiment in endurance. By the mid-20th century, as the federal system expanded, Leavenworth's model, massive walls, centralized control, strict silence, became the pattern for federal penitentiaries nationwide. Marion. Atlanta. Lewisburg. And later, Florence ADX. In Internal Bureau memos from 1988, planners referenced Leavenworth's operational stability as the ideal model for supermax control. The irony, that stability had always come at a cost, human minds breaking under quiet pressure. A retired warden admitted years later. We learned discipline from Leavenworth. But we also learned how fear becomes addictive, for both sides of the bars. The men who never left. Even after release, Leavenworth's influence followed its inmates like a shadow. Some former prisoners described the outside world as too loud, too free. One ex-inmate, interviewed for a 2014 Frontline documentary, said, "I did 10 years in Leavenworth and couldn't sleep with the door open for 5 more. Freedom didn't feel real. Silence did." Psychologists who studied long-term confinement patterns called this institutional haunting, a residual fear of losing control that persisted even in freedom. Others went the opposite way. Some men emerged stronger, disciplined, hyper-focused. Running small businesses, mentoring youth, or writing books about survival behind bars. They carried the code outside, turning its lessons into structure. One of them, identified in research as Inmate K, 77, became a counselor for at-risk teens. He told The Guardian, "Leavenworth taught me that power without empathy destroys everything. The code saved me, but it also trapped me. I still think in prison time. The walls and the world." Leavenworth's design philosophy, containment equals safety, has bled into modern society in ways most people never realize. From high-security schools to corporate surveillance systems, echoes of prison logic exist everywhere. Fixed cameras. Rigid routines. Restricted movement. Even the architecture of malls and airports mirrors institutional design, controlled flow, predictable paths, no surprises. Criminologists argue that Leavenworth was never just a prison, it was the foundation of America's social architecture. A reflection of the belief that fear maintains order. But order, as history proved, is fragile. Scars on the system. Leavenworth's reputation reached its peak during the cartel wars of the 1980s and 1990s, and its shadow still looms over modern corrections. The Supermax era that followed, epitomized by ADX Florence, borrowed its principles but magnified them. Where Leavenworth had silence, Florence had isolation. Where Leavenworth had hierarchy, Florence had total separation. One federal human rights report from 2015 described the progression as an evolution from fear to erasure. In that sense, Leavenworth didn't die, it transcended. Its influence now defines how the United States treats its most dangerous men. And even as the Bureau of Prisons introduces technology, education, and reform, the echoes of the old system remain. The rigid schedules, the dehumanizing uniformity, the belief that control is synonymous with safety. A former psychologist at the facility summarized it best. Leavenworth was supposed to civilize punishment. Instead, punishment civilized us. Reform and reflection. By the 2020s, public pressure began forcing change. Activists demanded transparency, former guards testified about mental health damage, and documentaries reignited public debate. Leavenworth, now classified as a medium security facility, became a testing ground for federal prison reform. Education programs, therapy-based corrections, and workforce training initiatives replaced some of its old routines. But the transformation was uneasy. Old guards still enforced old rules. The stone still whispered its history. When drones flew overhead in 2021 to document the building's layout, historians noticed something haunting. The shadows of its towers formed the shape of a cross on the yard. A symbol, perhaps, of redemption. Or sacrifice. Inside, many inmates said they could feel the change, not total freedom, but a softening. Leavenworth used to own your soul, one said. Now it just borrows it. A living monument. Today, Leavenworth stands as both a relic and a warning. Tourists drive by it without realizing they're looking at the birthplace of modern incarceration. Students in criminal justice programs study it as a case study in both innovation and cruelty. And in documentaries, the name still commands silence, Leavenworth, spoken like a ghost that never left American justice. Even the guards admit its pull. One current officer told PBS NewsHour in 2024. "Every time I walk the tiers, I feel the history pressing down. You know this place broke men tougher than anyone alive today. That's what keeps you humble." The legacy of fear. Leavenworth's walls may have aged, but their lessons endure. They taught America that discipline can protect, but also destroy. That silence can be peace, or torture. That fear can keep order, but never create change. The ghosts of its past still linger in every modern prison blueprint, every solitary cell, every rule written in the name of control. The question now is not whether Leavenworth will fade from memory, it won't. But whether the system it created can finally learn from its own reflection. Because the true prison isn't made of limestone and steel. It's made of belief, the belief that fear works. And until that belief changes, Leavenworth will never really die.